My name is Lit Marie, and I work with 240 to help teachers just like you pass their certification exams. This video is going to prepare you for the TExES Social Studies 7 through 12 exam. This is the test to take if you'd like to teach social studies in grades 7 through 12 here in Texas. And this video is going to cover 3 things: what content will be covered on the test and how to study for it, the most likely concepts or themes you will see on the exam, and of course, we're going to look at a few practice questions. There is a lot to cover, so let's get to it. The Social Studies 7 through 12 is broken into 7 sections called domains. Most of the domains account for roughly 13% of the exam, except for World History, which makes up 15% of the test, and US History, which is 20% of the exam. Each of these domains have competencies nestled under them. We're going to go over each of these competencies within the domains in this video, and of course, end with some practice questions to help you get a feel for what it's like on this exam. Let's start by digging into the history domains. There are 3 history domains with competencies that break up the content chronologically by year or by historical theme. And then the standards specifically identify key events, people, and concepts that questions may focus on. Now, all of this may seem overwhelming, but take a deep breath, because our study guide materials are designed specifically for these standards and topics to help you learn what is most likely to be on this exam. World history is the most expansive domain on this exam. So, I'm going to dig a bit deeper and break down the competencies for this domain a bit more than some of the others. Let's start by talking about what you might see in ancient world history questions. That is competency 1 under domain 1. Ancient world history questions tend to focus on 3 main themes. The first one, innovations and characteristics. Things like which civilization invented the wheel or writing. Both the Sumerians, by the way. The next important theme is how geography has impacted human development. More on that later. The third major theme of these questions is trade and interactions between civilizations. Things like who invaded whom and who cornered the market on gold. When you see a question about geography or ancient civilizations, an important thing to remember is water. Water allows for agriculture, which allows for human settlement, which allows for life as we know it. So it's pretty important. Moving on to competency 2. Let's take a look at some of the key themes for each competency's time period. Trade will still be a focus. The massive cultural impact of the Silk Road and the Crusades will likely come up a lot in these types of questions. The other major theme for this period is the lasting impact of the fall of Rome, namely the start of feudalism and related cultural and economic shifts. The next time period moves us into competency 3, which will focus on the long-term impacts of innovations and new philosophical ideas. Effects of the printing press will be a focus. Things like massive expansion of education and increased literacy, reduction in the power of the church, and the slow shift toward Enlightenment philosophies will show up in these questions. This period also includes the start of the boom in European exploration and colonization, so you might see questions about triangular trade and European conquest of other continents. The last period, competency 4, covers 1750 to the present. These questions focus heavily on modernization through philosophical shifts toward democratic leadership rather than monarchies, and the causes and effects of rapid industrialization and globalization. This includes the causes and effects of imperialism and colonization and decolonization of Africa, Eastern Europe, and Asia. We got through domain 1. Yay! Let's power through domain 2. Remember, these are the biggest domains, so the rest will go a bit faster after this. Onward and upward to US history. The competencies for US history are quite a bit more narrow than the world history ones, so I'm not going to break down each competency like I did for domain 1. But I do want to chat about some overall themes you might see in US history questions. For both exploration and colonization and the westward expansion competencies, geography may come up a lot. How humans shaped and were shaped by their surroundings as they settle regions of the US will be important for both of these competencies. These 2 competencies will also heavily focus on policies and events that shaped the experience of Native Americans from the initial arrival of the Europeans through the Indian removal policies of the 1800s. For both the Revolutionary Era and the political, economic, and social development competencies, you will see a lot of questions about the causes and effects of various laws and policies, including economic policies like tariffs and taxes. For the Revolutionary Era, these questions will focus on key figures and events. Both competencies will also heavily focus on identifying effects and characteristics of political ideologies such as federalism, Jacksonian democracy and mercantilism for the revolutionary period, as well as imperialism and isolationism and containment in the modern era. The U.S. as a world power competency will focus primarily on issues related to industrialization, U.S. expansion or imperialism, and the United States' role in global conflicts. That was a lot of things that we covered with U.S. history. Don't stress out. Our study guides are specifically designed to help you target your studying to what you are most likely to see on these exams. You'll need to know a lot of people, vocabulary, and key events, but we have flashcards to help you, so check this out. Our flashcards give you enough information to help you determine which answers are implausible without overwhelming you with facts you won't need. For example, with this information, you might be able to rule out any answer choices that try to trick you into thinking that Henry Clay was a US president. If it's not in his card, it's not a key fact about him. Whew, okay, that was so much information. You're doing great. We've made it through the 2 largest domains, so it's all smooth sailing from here. Here we go with Texas history in Domain 3. Texas history questions heavily focus on key figures and events. You will need to know key figures from the initial European settlement to Texas independence and all the way through to Texas in the modern era. Questions in this competency are also likely to ask you about the Texas economy related to various innovations and events, like the relationship between the invention of the combustion engine and the Texas oil industry. The last major theme of these types of questions is Texas geography and its relationship to Texas history and development. Hey, stick around because at the end of the video, we're going to go over a few sample questions and also some particular studying strategies for history type questions. Now, let's move out of history and into Domain 4, Geography, Culture, and Behavioral Sciences. This is a fairly broad list of topics to group together, but there are some common themes and frameworks that these kinds of questions will use. So, let's break down the competencies and talk about some themes that you will see across the entire domain. This domain will cover physical geography, culture, settlement patterns, interactions between humans and the environment, and fundamental concepts of sociology, anthropology, and psychology. Geography questions will cover things like how settlement patterns are affected by geography, natural forces such as tectonic plates and weather patterns, and different types of map projections. There are not typically a lot of questions that ask you to do things like, name this capital, or identify the longest river in the world. The questions on this exam are more about how geography affects humans today and throughout history. For these questions, it is important to remember a few key themes. Key theme number 1, water and fertile land are key for agriculture. Think about early river valley civilizations and the first American colonies. They are all near rivers and in plains regions to allow for farming. Proximity to oceans was also important for trade and travel, especially for European colonies. Key theme number 2, elements of geography like natural resources, climate, and nearby physical features often impact the success of a civilization or settlement. Human innovations are often related to geography. In early history, we can think about how humans used rivers to irrigate early farms. This is an example of humans both using the existing geography and shaping it to serve their own purposes. Now, let's talk for a second about the behavioral sciences portion of this domain. These questions will cover basic concepts of each of these disciplines, but ask you to apply these fundamental concepts to U.S. history. So you might see questions about how issues related to race or gender have impacted life in the U.S. throughout the 20th century. Like, for example, how the feminist movement impacted the U.S. workforce between the 1950s and the 1980s. The psychology questions will require you to have basic understandings of foundational principles like operant and classical conditioning and some of the key figures of psychology throughout the 20th century. So, you'll want to know your Freud from your Jung for these questions. Whoa, that was a lot of information. Are you still with me? We're more than halfway through our domain, so let's keep it rolling. What's next? Government and citizenship. Domain 5 is broken into 3 competencies: democratic principles in government in the U.S., citizenship and political processes in the U.S., and types of political systems. The first 2 competencies focus on the U.S. only. For these, you'll need to know the basics of U.S. political parties and their platforms throughout U.S. history, election and legislation processes, get ready for the Electoral College, the separation of powers, concepts and foundational documents, key figures in U.S. politics throughout history, causes and effects of major political movements in the U.S., and finally, structures and functions of the Texas state government. This domain loves to ask you to compare and contrast government structures or documents, so our materials are designed to help you draw connections between documents, ideas, and systems of government that are likely to come up on these types of questions. Check out this Venn diagram that compares the functions of the Articles of Confederation and the U.S. Constitution. This type of study material will better help you understand similarities, differences, and core principles of documents and government structures to nail these government and citizenship questions. Okay, moving on to Domain 6, Economic Science, Technology, and Society. These competencies break down into basic economic concepts and types of economic systems, the structure and the operation of the U.S. economy, and economic issues relating to science, technology, and society. These first 2 are fairly straightforward. You can expect to be asked about differences between and characteristics of major economic systems like communism, socialism, and capitalism, the major figures and principles of each of those systems, and how they have been implemented throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. You'll also be asked about the U.S. economy both in theory and in practice. Holy cow, we've covered so much! And here we are at our very last domain, which is all about understanding foundational social studies concepts and how to teach social studies. Questions in this domain require you to demonstrate your knowledge of social studies concepts, but also you'll need to understand how to teach these concepts to secondary students. To show your own social studies skills, you may be asked to do some of the following: define key social studies vocabulary, identify practical applications of social studies concepts, understand how various disciplines intersect, identify appropriate research methods, and interpret raw data or graphics. To show your knowledge of curriculum design, you will likely be asked to identify appropriate instructional activities or assessment methods based on a stated instructional goal. For these types of questions, you will need to draw both your content knowledge and your understanding of pedagogy for teaching social studies. Here's my next tip. When you're answering questions that give you a scenario and ask you to choose the best pedagogical approach, consider these 3 things. Would it help students reach the instructional goal provided in the question? Is it appropriate for the given grade level? And last, is the content the best choice given what you know about the topic? These questions can be tricky, so be sure to think about each of those factors before you select your correct answer. And that is it for domains. You made it, yes! Now for our last task, practice questions. First, I'll go over 4 questions similar to what you might see on the test. I will also provide some study and test-taking strategies that might help you in the heat of the moment on test day. So, here we go. What was the effect of the Edict of Milan? This question is fairly narrow and may be hard to reason through if you don't remember what the Edict of Milan was. So we're going to use the process of elimination method to try and find the right answer. These answer choices all revolve around Christianity in Europe, and one mentions Charlemagne. So let's use those to help jog our memories. We might remember that the Edict of Milan has something to do with early Christianity in Europe. Answer choice A seems to suggest that the Edict of Milan was a political event that unified a region under a ruler. The rest of the options directly reference religion, so that seems like an odd man out. Let's keep that in mind and keep reading. B directly uses the phrase religious tolerance. So if the edict was about religion, as B, C, and D suggests, that seems like a good possibility. The events of choice C definitely occurred. But I know that religious tolerance across all religions occurred hundreds of years before Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. I also know that it was the Edict of Thessalonica that made Christianity the official religion of Rome. So I can personally rule out C. So let's move on to D. Did this edict cause religious conflict? That seems in direct opposition to choice B. So I feel like it either has to be B, religious tolerance, or D, widespread religious conflict. I know B happened, and I have read about it. I also can't think why a Roman emperor would pass an edict that caused religious conflict. I know they were trying to quell religious conflict, so I'm going to go with B. The Edict of Milan established religious tolerance in Europe. You may have noticed that I used a few strategies as I answered that question. Let's go over them. Here's my next hot tip. Process of elimination is your best friend on questions like this. Here's how to maximize your chances to remove the incorrect answers and land on the right choice. First things first, get a good overview of an event or topic. Do this by studying our guide materials and test your knowledge by trying to explain what you learned to a friend. Then, use historical landmarks based on your overview knowledge to guide you when you're answering the questions. The best landmarks are big, important events in history that you can use to anchor your historical knowledge. For example, you might want to memorize when Christianity was made the official religion of the Roman Empire and some key facts about that event. You can use that knowledge to help you in questions related to the end of the Roman Empire, religious persecution and conflict within the Roman Empire, and the reigns of Charlemagne and Constantine, two majorly important figures. A lot of history can be understood based on cause and effect relationships, so having some big events in your brain to use as landmarks can really help. Choose landmarks that had important ripple effects like the invention of the printing press, the Crusades, the fall of Rome, and so on. Those landmarks can help you order events and rule out incorrect answers on multiple choice history questions. Whew, that's it for history. Let's move on to a question in domain 4, geography, culture, and social sciences. For this one, we're going to focus on a psychology question. Let's take a quick look. Which of the following types of conditioning results in behaviors that are involuntary? This is another one where it will be hard to reason through the answer. You kind of just have to know it. So for this one, let's focus on my next study tip. Memorize an illustrative example. Most people use the classic example of Pavlov and his dogs. He's the guy that discovered classical conditioning. This was the experiment that he used to prove his theory, and it was memorable. Remembering that example will help you remember the term. So now, we can revisit the question and use our study tip. Based on our memorable example, we know that Pavlov's dogs began to salivate when they heard the sound of the bell, even when there was no food. That's involuntary. So we know the answer is C. Classical conditioning results in involuntary behaviors like salivating. You're doing great. Let's try one from the government and citizenship competency next. Remember how I said that this test likes to make you compare and contrast federal and state government structures? Well, this is one of those, so let's check it out. While the structure of the Texas government is similarly designed to the federal government, its executive branch is much weaker than the federal executive branch. So, which of the following is an example of a way in which the power of the governor is more limited in Texas? Okay, this is a tricky one because you need to know things about both the federal and state government structures and separation of powers. Choice C implies that unlike the US president, who appoints many other members of the executive branch, the Texas governor does not do that. Instead, most members are elected. If you live in Texas, you probably have had the opportunity to vote on some of these positions. This one is the correct answer. Okay, so we've tried a handful of questions that focus on content. Let's try one from Domain 7, which focuses on social studies foundations, skills, and instruction. Here we go. A teacher is planning a 20th century history unit in which students create a project that explores cause and effect relationships between events. Which type of graphic would students be most likely to create when exploring cause and effect relationships between events? A population pyramid, a timeline, a physical map, or a line graph? This question gives a lot of info you really don't need. Just focus on the stated objective, which is to help students understand cause and effect relationships in history. We need to decide which of these graphics would actually do that. The timeline is definitely our best choice here because cause and effect relationships are strongly dependent on chronology. A timeline is often used when discussing these types of relationships between events. My last hot tip is about answering Domain 7 questions. For almost all questions related to teaching or pedagogy, the best thing you can do is be sure to read the question carefully and make sure that the answer you're selecting targets the stated objective and grade level. A lot of the answers may sound like perfectly fine options or even valuable academic experiences for students. So, it will be very, very important to ensure that you're selecting the choice that best targets the stated objective or situation. Let's end by recapping our major tips. Number 1, start your studying process by getting a good overview of key concepts or events and test your knowledge by explaining it to a friend. 2, learn some historical landmarks. These can and should include names of key figures and events related to your landmarks. Tip number 3, pick some memorable examples of tough concepts and compare them to the examples or definitions you see on the test. Finally, tip number 4 is for pedagogy questions, and that one is simple. Read carefully and target the stated objective. If you remember these tips and use our materials to guide you, you will have everything you need to reason your way through each question, even if you don't know that 100%. This is a tricky test, but you can do it. Congratulations on finishing the video. If you found it helpful, give it a like. Now, there's still plenty more to learn. Did you know that our study guide has hundreds of practice questions? If you really want to make sure you're prepared for the TExES Social Studies 7 through 12 exam, take the next step and subscribe to the 240 study guide. It has hours of videos so you can watch and listen even while doing chores. Most importantly, it is test aligned so you know precisely what you need to study. It has hundreds of practice questions so you can be sure you're ready. So click the link below right now to get started.